About 15 years ago now, me and my friend Hal decided to take our families out to Makoakita Caves for a camping trip. Me and Hal had been friends since we were kids, and having grown up around Makoakita, we'd visited the state park a whole bunch of times when we were children, so we knew it pretty well. Makoakita has more caves than any other place in Iowa, and a lot of them are connected via a series of small tunnels and larger passageways. Seeing as it's a kind of natural wonder, it's become a major tourist attraction for folks that are interested in those sorts of things. And so depending on what time of year it is, the western side of Makoakita can get pretty busy sometimes. And they're a lot like you'd imagine, I guess. The caves, I mean. With rangers guiding visitors along long wooden walkways as they explain the differences between stalagmites and stalactites. Some of them are closed to the public from time to time when they become structurally unsafe, but we figured the smaller ones would be safe enough for the kids to explore, and they could have a little fun while getting in touch with a little local heritage at the same time. But what we didn't know on the drive out there was that organizing that camping trip would turn out to be one of the worst decisions we ever made. We drove up in early fall just as the leaves started to turn, but with a little late summer heat still hanging in the air, we picked out a large campsite close to a bunch of smaller caves and then had lunch out of some picnic baskets that the wives had made. And afterwards, we took the kids on a little walk around the area to talk them through some basic forestry stuff. You know, don't leave food lying around, stay put if you get lost, etc. And then we headed back to camp. And it was an awesome day. And then once the kids were asleep, us grown-ups got to have a little time to ourselves around the campfire with a couple of wine coolers. The next morning, me and Hal got to enjoy the same early morning camp vibes that we hadn't shared since we were children. And by that, I mean the smells of wood smoke, coffee, frying up some bacon, all rolled into one. I truly believe there is no finer combination of smells on God's green earth, and if you'd had to ask me that morning, I'd have told you that we were in for another fine day of camping. But over the next few hours, it felt like our whole entire worlds were unraveling. Our kids were a mix of boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 10, so they had no problem getting along and playing together. Then in the early afternoon, they asked if they could go play near one of the caves nearby. Hal and I had checked it out earlier that morning and found a large mouth with a narrow tunnel connected into the darkness at the rear. We told the kids if they stayed near the entrance and didn't head down the tunnel, they were fine to go play out there. And so off they went. But then not even half an hour had gone by before we heard a sudden and terrifying screech from one of the girls. We all went tearing off through the trees in the direction of the caves, and soon found the kids running back to us in the opposite direction. They were either in tears or scared out of their minds, but all agreed on the same version of events. They'd been doing as they were told, and been playing near the cave, not inside of it, when they noticed a man suddenly creeping out from its mouth. And they knew well enough to keep away from strangers, but said the man looked so creepy that they stopped playing and got ready to run. My daughter said they all just stood there still for a second, watching as the guy stepped towards them. He asked if they'd like a free tour of his cave, and then when they said no, he started claiming that he was friends of their parents, i.e. us, and that he'd been asked to watch us. And the kids were between 7 and 10, so they were young still, but not altogether incredibly dumb. And then one of the kids said that they didn't believe him, and that's when the guy chased them. I had 100 questions to ask them, but in the moment, all me and Hal were interested in was where the guy had gone after chasing them. The kids didn't know, and they thought that he was still following them, so, on instinct, me and Hal went rushing toward that cave. Hal had always been faster than me. He'd been on the track team in high school, and he probably could have played football if he was a little bit bigger like I was. And so that day, he went tearing through the trees way ahead of me, and was maybe 20 feet ahead by the time he saw the cave mouth, and the man that had almost snatched up one of our kids. I heard him yell out, "I see him," and then somehow he seemed to speed up for that last 50 yards or so. I didn't see who he was talking about, I was just too far behind, but just knowing that they were still there made my blood boil, and I tried my best to catch up. Hal shouted, "He's in the cave," right as he broke from the tree line. I figured that he'd just guard the entrance till the cops came, but Hal went right in after him. I yelled at him to wait, but he didn't listen, and I guess he was right not to in a sense. It turned out that the cave was a dead end and the guy really was getting away. But at the time, I thought that he was crazy going running off into the dark with nothing but the flashlight on his phone to light the way. I stayed put at the mouth of the cave, yelling for Hal to come back because we had that guy cornered. But he didn't. Instead, about a minute went by before I realized that I might have to go in after him. But no sooner had I stepped forward that Hal had appeared from the darkness, and he looked pale and shaken. I asked him what happened, and Hal just said he got away. But instead of stopping in front of me, he just walked right past me and over towards the trees. As I followed, asking if he at least got a good look at the guy, I could see Hal was shaking, and then he suddenly just stopped and put both hands on the top of his head in the way that people do when they're struggling to process something or just got bad news. That body language and that look of shock in his eyes, it took me half the story already, but Hal looked at me in a way that reminded me of a much younger version of him, and in a way that made him look smaller almost. And then he told me, I had him, and I let him go. And it was like he either didn't know how to explain it or didn't know how to put it into words. But after telling him to spit it out for God's sakes, he did. Hal said he ran to the back of the cave, switched on his phone's light, and then caught a glimpse of the guy turning down some side tunnel. The guy was fast, but Hal was faster, and within seconds he'd caught up with the guy after chasing him down that side tunnel. And when the guy was within arm's length, Hal reached out with one free hand to try and grab him, but the guy spun around, yanked himself out of Hal's grip, and then just hissed at him. Hal said he hissed like a goddamn cat, and then tried swiping at him with nails that were so long and yellowed they'd almost look like claws. The guy bared his teeth as he hissed too, and Hal said that they were so dark and rotten it was a miracle that they were even still in his head. The guy was crazy. He had to be. Otherwise, there was no way that he'd be wandering around those tunnels looking like he hadn't washed in over a year. But to think that there was still enough of him left up there in his mind to try and drag a child back into the dark with him, it was chilling, and I completely understand why Hal was so shaken. By the time we got back to camp, my wife had already called 911, and there was a ranger headed to our location to talk to us. When he arrived, he confirmed that there was almost no point searching the caves as there were so many entrances and exits scattered around the park that if he knew them all, the guy could just be about anywhere. And they only slightly reassured us by saying that it was impossible for anyone to live in the cave system, not without them knowing about it anyway. They'd also keep their eyes peeled for anyone matching his description wandering around the park, because if they did, he'd be immediately arrested and we'd be immediately informed. And as you can imagine, the kids refused to spend another night in the park, so we unfortunately had to call it quits on our camping trip. And now that I mention it, me and Hal were just about the only ones who didn't want to leave. But not because we didn't want the trip to end. It was more like we wanted nothing more than to hunt down the son of a bitch that had tried to grab one of our kids. But we were just two overworked and overtired dads. If the Rangers knew that trying to seal off the whole cave system wasn't going to do any good at that stage, then what the hell could we do? It was frustrating, but that feeling faded quickly. What didn't was that lingering feeling that no matter how safe you think that you are, it's almost impossible to protect our children from those who want to do them harm. Hal fell down something of a deep rabbit hole too, trying to dig up any information that he could on other encounters with that freak that ran off into the tunnels. He didn't find anything. But I know that he still thinks about the cave guy from time to time. He regrets getting so spooked by the guy's appearance and wishes that he'd given him the ass-kicking he deserved when he had the chance. And I can't say I blame him. And I'd pay a heck of a lot of money for 5 minutes alone in a windowless room with that absolute piece of trash. So a long, long time ago, my friend named Joe and I went on a little camping trip out in the Cascades. Joe was easily one of the funniest guys I've ever met. Like, so funny that he could have done a talk show or something. I always used to tell him to try stand-up comedy, but he always said that he was too shy and that he could only be funny around people he was comfortable with. It was pretty rare up in Washington to get a weekend without rain, even in the high summertime. So when we found out that there was going to be a whole 3 days in October when the chance of precipitation was below 20%, we knew that it was the single best chance for us to go camping without ending up like drowned rats with crotch rot. Joe came to pick me up on the Friday afternoon after we both got off of work early. And then a couple of hours later, we were roasting wieners and cracking some beers around a campfire. Camping trips with Joe always went a little too fast. It felt like 1 minute you were setting up your tent, and then the next you were packing it away again after laughing your ass off for like 2 or 3 days straight. And that time was no different. Granted, all the beer we drank probably helped turn everything into one big blur of open containers and split sides, but it really was like 2 whole days just flew by before we were loading up the cars again and preparing to head home. We had everything packed away and were literally just about to leave when Joe says, "Oh, hold up, I need to use the bathroom." Now, I told him no problem, just be quick because I was starving. But then he says, "It's not like that kind of bathroom break. It might be a while." I remember rolling my eyes and just cursing the timing, but Joe then responds, "Hey, when nature calls, dude," and then slipped out of the passenger seat and around to the trunk to go fishing through our packs for toilet paper. He finds it, and then off he goes into the trees to take his dump. I was reading an old World War II book at the time, and I kept it in the compartment of my driver's door. So as Joe's off using the bathroom, I figured that I could work my way through a page or two before we got back. And I ended up getting a little too engrossed in a passage about German paratroopers in Crete and how the locals came out to stab them with pitchforks when their chutes snagged on trees. And so when Joe came literally sprinting back screaming, "Start the effing car," it just about scared the crap out of me. I didn't ask any questions. I trusted Joe enough to do exactly what he asked and gun the engine without needing to know what was coming. And it was only once we were moving that I asked what the hell had happened. But I didn't need an answer because as I looked up in the rear view, I saw a man with a bandana covering his face break from the trees and start giving chase to us. And though I didn't see exactly what was in his hands, I could see that he was carrying some kind of long-handled weapon, like an axe or a pole or something. And as you can imagine, I immediately threw the car up a gear and then put my damn foot down because the guy was running full pelt. We easily avoided him once we picked up some real speed, but my hands were still shaking for a long time after we finally hit the highway. Once the guy was out of sight, I started demanding Joe to tell me what the hell had just happened. He said he was looking for a place to poop. When he saw a thicket of bushes and some small trees, he figured he could guarantee some privacy, because we're now way back near the dirt roads and so way closer to other hikers and stuff. Now anyway, he said he pushed his way through the bushes and came out the other side, only to see that bandana man, who was actually holding an axe, standing over a blue tarp laid out on the ground. There were no bodies, no victims, living or dead, just the Axeman and his tarp. But the moment he and Joe locked eyes, Joe knew that he meant no good. The look on the guy's face was a clue, but then chasing after him with that axe was probably the biggest giveaway of all, because I'm sure you all agree. He most likely wasn't catching up to Joe to give him a hug, or calmly explain how there had been some terrible misunderstanding. And neither did Joe stop to ask what he was doing in the woods with an axe and a tarp, because that's one of those questions that just does not need to be asked. You see something like that and you run. No questions, no hesitation. And so we called the cops from the first gas station we came across, but as you can imagine, they didn't do anything. Joe got a call a couple of days later saying some cops had taken a look around and questioned a couple of bikers. But ultimately they couldn't find anything and they didn't have any suspects. Now that was bad enough, but the cop Jake spoke to tried to reassure him that what he'd seen might not have been as sinister as he assumed, and that it all might have been that terrible misunderstanding I mentioned. Now Jake said there was absolutely zero chance that he'd misjudged the situation. but all the cops said before he hung up was that he'd keep Jake updated if there were any developments. But there weren't any, and that was the last we heard of it. We still talk about that day, though, and we talked a whole lot about what that guy might have been up to back there. We don't think that tarp or that axe was for Joe. We think that guy brought them out there for someone else. But we also think that given that Joe had seen him and was therefore about to be a witness to whatever he was about to do, Joe was no doubt about to end up getting chopped up on that tarp, along with whoever it was originally intended for. What I'm about to tell you is the single most enduring mystery of my life, something I've thought about for decades now. I'm okay with meeting my makers, having not understood the great whys and hows of the world, but I'd think I'd do just about anything to know the truth of what I saw out in the woods all those years ago. So if any of you listening are familiar with anything I'm talking about, just know that I'll be lurking in the comments section, reading everything that y'all have to say if I find out that this story makes it to a video. Now, way back when I was still in my early 20s, myself and a few of my friends were on a camping trip in late October. So it was my buddy Greg, my buddy Steven, and his girlfriend Mina and I, with me and Greg in one tent and Steven and Mina in another. We were out near Washington and Jefferson here in Virginia, and the first day all we did was hike there, get set up, and then eat dinner and drink a couple of mugs of hot chocolate before climbing into our sleeping bags. The next day was pretty cool too, because we got to take a walk around the area and catch some views of all the leaves turning. It was incredibly beautiful, and one of those things in nature that makes you think that there might be an artist's hand at work, so to speak. We gathered up some chestnuts for roasting, watched the squirrels bounding around and burying their breakfast that they'd be eating after hibernation was over, and it was near perfect. The exact kind of fall minication that we needed before the nights got way colder and way longer. But then in the early evening, when it was Greg's turn to collect firewood, everything changed. We'd built quite a large campfire, and since it was so cold with nights that were lasting much longer, we'd kept it burning for maybe 8 hours each night before letting it burn out. We'd stripped pretty much every piece of kindling and firewood from a 100-meter radius, meaning poor Greg had to wander a little further to get the fuel that we needed. I was rooting through my bag for something when I suddenly heard him yelling "guys" from way off. Now he comes sprinting back saying, "You gotta see this." And then we followed him off into the trees to see what he was looking for. And the first thing I saw when we got to where we were going were these sort of grave-shaped patches of disturbed earth beneath a bunch of trees. And there was a lot of cursing, a lot of holy craps and what the Fs, but that wasn't even the half of it. Greg then says, "Look at the trees." And when I did, I saw that each of the tree trunks that had disturbed earth at their bases also had faces carved into them. Each was carved at the same height, and although all of their eyes were closed, each face was different, almost like it was a representation of the person buried underneath. And after we all stared in horror at the scene for a moment or two, we ran back to our camp to call the cops. And maybe an hour or two later, we had a ranger show up at our camp so we could show her where the graves were. She acted kind of skeptical at first, and I guess she had every right to. But once we walked her out to where we'd been, she looked just as freaked out as we did, and then said there'd most likely be a whole police forensics team out there before day's end. And after that, we made our way back to camp again, but we didn't much feel like staying in that same location, not with those graves and those carvings looking so fresh. And so we drove to the complete other side of the park again before setting up for our final night. It was terrifying knowing that we'd stumbled across something so disturbing, and that whoever did it might still be in the area. And it was kind of comforting to know that we were far away from the site of their work, but none of us were able to totally relax until days later when we were back at home and the cops called us to give an update. It was good news in a lot of ways because after digging up all those so-called graves that we saw, they didn't find a single scrap of human remains, and each and every one of them was empty. The cop Greg spoke to thanked him for calling the whole thing in because public reports like that are a huge part of police work, but ultimately, it we found nothing but a few holes and some weird carvings. Only, we didn't just find a few holes and some carvings, and we all knew it. Unless it was some kind of art piece or some kind of Native American thing that I'm ignorant to, then fine, that wouldn't freak me out. But all other alternatives give me the shivers when I think about them. If it was one dude whose idea of fun was digging fake graves and carving faces into the trees, then what the actual heck? That's freaky as hell. But then if there's like a group of people all doing it for some sinister purpose, then that might be even scarier for some other reason. Mina later said that just maybe it was some kind of ritual, but maybe a positive one. She pictured a bunch of people going out into the woods to bury their old selves and put old ghosts to rest, and then walking out feeling lighter with the ceremony having helped them get free of whatever was hanging around their necks. I kind of like that interpretation. I just can't bring myself to believe it. And in my darkest moments, I think we came across something very sinister. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. Just over 20 years ago now, back in the fall of 2003, myself and my buddy Daryl decided to head out on a weekend of hunting and camping here in our native Wyoming. It had been a good 6 years since our last trip, on account of Daryl getting married and having children, and we'd missed it something awful, I'll tell you. Daryl had always said, once the boys are out of diapers, I'll have time for trips again. And then boom, he went and had another one and the process started all over again. But then when his first kid was 6 and his second was almost 3, his wife hit him with divorce papers and he got a DUI that same week. He might have had a chance if it wasn't for that intox charge, but with his wife's attorney being able to paint him as some drunk and a deadbeat, he didn't have a leg to stand on like most men. She took the kids, the house, the dog, and half his money. Daryl got to keep his business in the car, but that was pretty much it. And the first thing I asked once he told me all about this was, well, what do you want to do about it? And he thought for a few seconds and then just said, let's go hunting. Now cut to about a week later, hunting season is in full swing, and Daryl and I are way out in the sticks setting up camp for the next couple of days. And it was the most alive I'd ever seen him in a while, and doing something that we hadn't done in a while made me feel about 10 years younger. I made sure to avoid all the topics related to families or relationships too, and stuck to football and hunting and just reminiscing to keep him firmly in that bubble of escape, even if it was only for a short while. Once we were set up and had our blaze on, which are those bright orange pieces of clothing, we head out into the woods to track some deer. It's a long and slow and very quiet process, but that's exactly what Daryl needed. We took our time with it, and we didn't see much aside from a few squirrels stashing some nuts for winter, but that didn't bother us. It felt far too good to be back where we belonged. Just our rifles, the trees, the forest, and nature. A couple of hours in, we spotted what looked like a 4 or 6-person tent off to our left through the trees. And then, presuming whoever owned it was also there to hunt, we figured it was best to just head over to say hi. We were about halfway over when we started yelling howdy, but no one came out of the tent. And then I noticed, ringing the entrance, there were a whole bunch of canvas lean-tos sheltering what looked like big black gun cases. I realized they had a whole arsenal out there with them. The tent slept no more than 6, but there had to be at least a dozen cases outside of it. I remember Daryl speaking up and saying that it didn't feel right creeping around someone's campsite when they weren't around. Now, I agree we probably should have just moved on once we realized the place was deserted, and I remember hoping that we'd run into whoever owned all those cases so I could find out whose army they were up against. And then I looked up at Daryl, just in time to see the arm of his jacket explode with a spray of the stuffing from inside of it. And then as he was falling, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the trees around us. I fell with him, not because I'd been hit, but because I needed to crawl to him. I had absolutely no idea why the shooter opened fire, but I'd been standing right in front of one of the traps and gun cases. Daryl hadn't, meaning he was still exposed. And as I crawled, I remember seeing the dirt near Daryl's shoulder explode as a bullet slammed into the ground. I told him to roll towards me if he could, and then when he did, grimacing in pain, another bullet hit the dirt right where he'd been laying. And once we had a little cover between us and the shooter, they didn't stop firing. They aimed for the gaps between the cases, trying to hit us by firing over them. And I felt like I was going to void my bowels every time I heard a bullet snap above our heads, but none of them hit. My biggest fear while laying there in the dirt was that while one person was firing to keep our heads down, another was approaching to finish us off. I tried rolling on my side and shouldering my rifle, telling Daryl to stop the bleeding from his arm, but otherwise not to move. And then I waited, shaking with fear, hoping that I could get a decent shot on whoever was approaching before they got the drop on us. But no one approached. And when the firing suddenly stopped, I figured whoever was shooting was having to reload. Daryl recognized it too, and he was already getting ready to find his feet when I told him it was time to move. He didn't even try to bring his rifle with him. He knew better than that. We just got up and ran to put the tent between us and the shooter, but even then, that didn't stop them. Because once we were behind it, a bullet came so close that I literally heard it zip and not crack, meaning it punched through the tent before passing within just a couple of feet of us. It was practically a trick shot, whereby the shooter deduced that we'd been using the tent for cover and tried to hit one of us based on where he figured we'd be. It only occurred to me later that assuming it was the tent's owner shooting at us, they must have wanted to kill us really badly if they were willing to put holes in their own shelter. We ran till Daryl said that he couldn't anymore, and he looked pale and sweaty. And when I looked, his arm was bleeding heavily from the bicep area, and he kept asking if he was going to die, and I remember telling him, not if I can help it. I had a pretty basic first aid kit with me, so enough bandage to tie a basic tourniquet around Daryl's arm. But tying that thing was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my whole life, because I had to give my rifle to Daryl to hold with his good hand and tell him to shoot anyone who came over that ridge that looked like they wanted to do us harm. He could barely hold that rifle upright with one arm, let alone steady, so it felt barely any better than just setting it down on the ground. But just that thin layer of security gave me enough focus to wrap Daryl's arm, and then we were on the move again. At the time, I figured the people who shot us would be following us so they could finish us off. But looking back, I think they knew our next move would be the hospital and then the cops, so they were probably interested in packing their gear away and getting out of there. Either way, it was a relief when I realized that we weren't being followed. But there was still the issue of getting Daryl to a hospital before he bled to death. We obviously couldn't just head back the way we came, so we had to kind of dogleg around where we thought the weird camp had been in order to avoid it. But this only extended our journey, and at some points, I thought Daryl might pass out and I'd be forced to actually carry him. He kept telling me to just leave him so I could run ahead and get to safety, but I kept telling him to shut the hell up and that I'd drag him out of those woods if I had to. It took a few hours, and Daryl was having to lean on me for support by the end of it, but we finally made it back to my truck with him awake and still on his feet. It was a relief, but it didn't feel like I could altogether relax again till the doctors at the hospital said he'd be fine and that he wouldn't lose the arm either. He'd have to stay in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and he'd have to go through all kinds of rehab to make sure that he retains his arm's full range of motion, but aside from that, he was going to be fine. I was allowed to talk to him for a while before his surgery, and he thanked me for getting him out of those woods. I told him I knew that he'd do the same thing for me if it were the other way around, because that's what friends are for. Back in 2012, when me and my mates were in our mid-20s, we asked a mutual friend what he'd like to do for his birthday. Now, he doesn't want to be named, so I'm just going to call him Birthday Boy. Now, we thought BB would be wanting to go clubbing, which was the same thing that he'd want to do every year. But then in September of 2012, when we asked him if he wanted to head to Newcastle or Manchester for a night out, he said no. He didn't want to go to Newcastle or Manchester or even London for that matter. Instead, Birthday Boy wanted to go to Wales because he wanted to go camping. It wasn't the first time he'd mentioned wanting the group to swap the great indoors for the great outdoors, so it didn't come as some massive shock. But then, since we'd never gone camping as a group before, organizing the trip was a hell of a lot more complicated than booking a hotel and a few train tickets. We had to scout out a decent location and purchase a ton of personal equipment and brush up on some of the more basic survival techniques like basic first aid, lighting fires, and which mushrooms to avoid. Spoilers, it's all of them. And we also had to work out how we were going to stay warm and dry because this wasn't going to be some sun-soaked summer camping weekend. We were going in October, and our friend's birthday month, and being in the UK, just about the only thing that we could be certain of is that the weather was going to be horrible. On the day of the trip, the weather was just as crap as we expected, but we were in such high spirits that we didn't give a monkey's toss if it rained sideways. We drank a few cans of lager on the train over to Wales, and then polished off a few more as we walked to the campsite that we had picked out, which was a short walk from a lake. And as we got to the bottom of this country lane, we spotted a small house with a man doing some gardening out the front, and he stood up and looked at us as we passed by. I gave him a nod, and he asked where we were going. I pointed down the lane and told him that we planned to camp by the lake. He didn't exactly look pleased to see us, but when we mentioned the campsite, he sort of just grinned a little bit. And then he says, I wouldn't go down there if I were you lads. The shores of that lake are haunted." And we were only 15 minutes walk away, so I asked him how he himself fared with the ghosts since he lived so bloody close. And he simply pointed to the little wooden cross above his doorframe and then said that we didn't strike him as believers. Now he was wrong. As our resident Bible basher, the birthday boy was quick to point that out. But all the bloke said back was, "Well, at least one of you will be all right. The rest of you, I can't speak for." Martin, who was quite easily the funniest of the four of us, made a ghostly noise like, "Ooh," which sent us all into hysterics. But the Welshman didn't laugh. He just kept that grin on his face and told us, "Mark my words, boys. You'll see." And we knew that he was just trying to scare us, and being just a week before Halloween, we sort of appreciated it in a weird way. And so after making our way down to the lake, we pitched our tents about 100 meters from the shoreline. We had a great first night. We got a campfire going and then cooked some food on it. And then after a few more beers to wish the birthday boy his many happy returns, we climbed into our tents and went to sleep. Now I remember the ground was nice and soft because of how mossy it was, much more comfy than I imagined it would be. And then as I was drifting off, I started to hear this gentle patter of rain against my tent, which only added to that feeling of coziness. But then, maybe 4 or 5 hours later, I woke up to find my sleeping bag was damp. And then I found that water had been leaking in from outside the tent, and that's because, by that stage, we were well on our way to being underwater. And the spot that we picked to camp was some kind of miniature flood basin, and as it rained, the ground underneath us was slowly flooding. And when we realized this, just before sunrise at about 6 in the morning, we were not best pleased, and as the person that had been foolish enough to pick that spot, I got an earful and then some from the lads. And I took it on the chin, of course, because they were right. We could all agree that it was a terrible place to camp and that I should have done more location scouting on Google Earth. But what we couldn't agree on was what to do next. One of us, not the birthday boy, wanted us to just abandon ship and go find a bed and breakfast to stay in before heading home the next day as planned. But then the birthday boy didn't want the trip to end and thought that we could find somewhere else to camp before drying off around the campfire. I agreed, and so did our friend Martin, but Mr. Bed and Breakfast was refusing to budge, no matter how much we argued that he should honor the birthday boy's wishes. Now, we were all tired and damp, so it got quite vicious at times. And so vicious, in fact, that our one friend Martin was basically like, "F this. If you two are going to argue like little kids, I'm just going to go for a smoke." And then he grabbed his rolling kit out of his bag, took out a pre-roll, and then walked off alone. We called after him, asking where he was going, but instead of telling us, he turned and showed us the walkie-talkie that he was carrying, as if to say, "Don't worry, I'm just one click away." and someone brought 2 walkie-talkies because they figured they'd be useful or fun. Now, we soon got back to arguing, and I'm not sure how long we went at it, but the sun had fully risen by the time we agreed that we should at least pack up and move somewhere else. As we started to pack up, the birthday boy suggested that we call Martin on the radio so he could get back and join us in the packing up. And when I tried, I didn't get a response. Now, at first, I got it into my head that since Martin was off smoking some joint, he might have put his earbuds in for a little bit of music while he smoked. And it seemed a bit of a daft thing to do, but he was off chasing good vibes, so I didn't put it past him. Now, I reckon that I didn't give it about 10 minutes before I tried again, at which point Martin would surely respond. But again, he didn't. It was just radio silence, and it got very creepy very quickly. Now, I remember the exact moment after I said, "Martin, are you there, mate?" for like the 3rd time, which everyone had this sort of silent collective moment of, "Oh God." And there was no good reason Martin wasn't responding, so after we'd shaken most of the water out of our gear and packed it all away, we headed off in the direction that he'd walked to go look for him. Now, as we moved, the birthday boy tried to reassure us by suggesting the radio had just simply failed. He said the battery might have died, or it had reached its maximum range, or maybe it just couldn't handle the bumpy terrain. Now, I'll admit, that made me feel a little bit better, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away, and it only got worse as we made our way up to higher ground. The higher up the hillside we got, the more we got a bird's-eye view of the area that we slept overnight at. Now, we'd hoped that we might spot Martin wandering around, but he was nowhere to be seen. As the ground ahead leveled out and we hit a small section of woodland, we started calling out Martin's name in the hopes that he might hear us. We'd already tried calling him on his mobile a few times, but the phone reception in the area was so bad that we couldn't even squeeze a text message through. We also kept trying the radio in between calling out for him, but he still didn't respond, and the longer we went without contact, the more and more frightened we got. I mean, it was like something just sort of snatched him out of thin air, and having covered the ground that he must have walked on, it made zero sense that we hadn't found him already. Birthday boys then suggested that we'd bored him away with our arguing and that he might have spontaneously decided to just go home after having his smoke. But that wasn't Martin. He wasn't so passive-aggressive as to just march back to the train station while ignoring us on the radio. If he disappeared like that, it wasn't voluntary. We found a decent spot to camp in that wooded area I mentioned, but we didn't pitch our tents right then. Instead, we only dropped our bags and then walked right back the way we came to carry on looking for Martin. Now, I was getting pretty frustrated with the walkie-talkie not working, so I gave it to Chris, the guide we'd talked out of getting a B&B, and so he could take a turn trying to get Martin. We didn't have our packs on at the time either, so we were able to move around a lot faster and a lot more spread out so we could cover more ground. I remember at one point, me and the birthday boy were on some higher ground and still in the trees, while Chris walked down towards the lake to look around. Now, the birthday boy and I exchanged a few words about how concerned we were for Martin, then suddenly, we heard Chris shouting for us. We went running off to find him and found him running up towards us, and when he stopped, he looked terrified as he told us that Martin had contacted him in the radio. I knew it was going to be bad, but when I asked Chris what Martin said, his reply made my blood run cold when he stated, "Let me out." You know, there are those 5 stages of grief, and 2 are like denial and bargaining. That's what took over in the moments after Chris claimed Martin had whimpered, "Let me out," into the radio. The birthday boy and I were like, "Are you sure he didn't say something else? Or it's a prank. He's trying to scare us." "Of course he is. It's almost Halloween." But Chris was adamant. The voice was male, and he was certain. And he said a bunch of other stuff too, but the thing he heard for definite was, "Let me out," and it sounded like whoever said it was in pain. Obviously, at that point, the situation went from the eerie but simple, "Where's our mate gone?" to the more serious, "We need to call 999 right now." But like I mentioned, the phone reception in that area was absolute dog crap. That meant we had to run all the way back to the country lane back near where we were camped previously and just hope a car came along that we could flag down. Luckily, it took only about 10 minutes before we saw this van driving down the lane, and after flagging it down, the driver let us hop into the back. A few minutes later, he dropped us almost right back where we'd started that previous day. This was only a few miles from where Martin had gone missing, but more importantly, it had phone reception. And it was Chris that put the 999 call in while me and birthday boy listened. He sounded as panicked as we felt as he described what had happened. Then, after taking Martin's name, the dispatcher told us that she was going to try something. Since the most likely explanation was that Martin had been hurt in some way, she was going to check her database for any ambulance patients with the same name. That way, she might be able to find out what had happened to him and where he was headed. But then a minute or two later, the dispatcher comes back on the line to tell us that she's found Martin. You might think we greeted that news with relief, but we were still very much under the assumption that he's been a medical emergency. And she might have found him, but that didn't mean that he was okay. So when she said it, we were just sort of like, okay, go on. Martin was fine, and hearing that was when the relief hit. But the dispatcher also told us that he wasn't 100% okay because he'd been arrested. All she could tell us by law was that he'd been nicked by the police just a few hours before, and he was being held at the police station at Abergavenny. And we're just thinking, what? What did he get arrested for? We were given the number of Abergavenny police station, and after we called them, we found out Martin was most likely going to be released that evening after he'd been formally processed. At which point the long and arduous process of retrieving our gear and traveling to Abergavenny began. We were on the train and almost at the town's train station when Martin called us. He'd been released and was waiting for us at the pub near the train station. Then when we met, everyone was sitting down with a cold pint and Martin told us what had happened to him. Remember that country lane that I mentioned? The one that we used to hitch a ride down the road a bit? Well, that's exactly where Martin had walked after rolling his joint. He said that he'd found a tree stump that looked like a nice seat, but it was soaked after the night's rain, so instead of sitting down, he just started walking up and down the quiet lane, puffing away on his smoke. He walked right up to a bend in the track, and the morning's still peaceful and quiet. But right as he turns around, he hears an engine coming up the lane around the bend. He said that he thought it was just a farmer, someone who probably wouldn't pay him much attention. But when he looked back to see who was coming round that bend, he saw a police car. Now Martin is about 6 foot with bright red hair, and back then he wore a purple jacket and had his hair in dreadlocks. So as the cops drove round the bend at like 6:46 in the morning, all they saw was this giant white Rasta wearing bright purple who had a massive joint hanging out of his mouth. They were always going to give chase, or at least stop him to ask what he was about, and Martin knew this all too well. So instead of staying put to be questioned, hectored, and inevitably arrested, Martin decided to leg it. And he didn't get far. One policeman jumped out on sight while the other zoomed ahead and cut Martin off. He said he looked for a fence to hop or a gap in the hedge to squeeze through, and then by the time he realized that he was buggered, the police were quite literally on top of him. All he had on him was one spliff, but running meant that police hit him with a possession and attempting to flee a lawful stop or something like that. And that meant that they could drag him down to the station for processing, which they did, and that's why it seemed like something had just snatched him out of thin air. Because for all intents and purposes, something had. It was only prior to transportation, when the police were patting him down, that Martin realized the walkie-talkie's cheap clip had fallen free from his jacket while running, but he was in no position to ask to retrieve it, and off they went to the station. I remember the four of us sitting around that table all kind of ripping on Martin for getting arrested while remarking on the sheer bad luck of it all. But then Chris was suddenly like, well, hang on. Who was asking for help over the radio then? And the table was silent. Martin asked what we were on about, and then when we explained, it was his turn to think a prank was being pulled on him. And when we asked him to promise us that he hadn't said, "let me out," over the radio, Martin assured us that he hadn't used the radio at all. He'd walked off, taken a few puffs, and then, Bob's your uncle, he was in cuffs. No radio usage whatsoever, and he certainly hadn't said, "Let me out," after the cops put him in the car. But that left us all asking the question, who did? These days, we all collectively choose to believe that, just in the case of that man near the lake who tried to convince us it was haunted, the weird radio transmissions were more of the same. Someone had found the radio, heard us asking, "Mart, are you there?" and thought to themselves, how can I scare the pants off these numpties in as few words as possible? Well, if that was you, and you just so happen to be listening to this, then well done. What you did had proved an enduring mystery to us, and one we care not to think about during those quiet midnight hours when alternative and much darker explanations begin to rear their ugly heads. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured in the next video. Who knows? And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to find me in Thailand's cheese caves.